Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Danielle was the kind of woman that many admired in silence. There was something about the way she made her decisions that conveyed balance, as if she always knew exactly where she wanted to go. From the beginning of her relationship with Patrick, the people around them saw the two as the ideal couple. That union of 8 years, 5 of which were marriage, seemed solid enough to withstand any challenge. They made plans together, split the bills, shared dreams, daily anxieties, and laughed easily. If you observed them, you'd say that this was a story written with care. But what others didn't see was the silent conflict growing inside Danielle. For a long time, she managed to push the idea of motherhood aside as something to be resolved later. She preferred to say that it wasn't the right time yet, that her career needed attention, that their apartment couldn't accommodate another life, that the two of them still had much to explore together. But the questions started coming more frequently. First, during gatherings with friends, in the form of jokes. Then, at family lunches, as veiled expectations. Finally, in looks from her mother-in-law, which spoke louder than any words. And even though Patrick never demanded anything, his silence began to weigh more than any direct pressure. Danielle found herself imagining what it would be like to give up her free routine, last-minute trips, nights when she simply slept after watching a movie without interruptions. She wondered if she could become a mother and still remain herself. She was afraid of disappearing into the figure of a woman who only serves, who takes care, who gives. A fear she couldn't name, but that grew like a persistent discomfort. During work hours, she tried to focus, meet deadlines, deal with clients, but everything seemed like a backdrop for the turmoil dominating her mind. It was on one of those confusing days that she accepted Chase's invitation to have lunch outside. Nothing major. Just two coworkers with projects in common. But there was a lightness in that moment that she hadn't felt in a while. While eating, Danielle began talking about the pressure at home. Chase listened attentively, without offering solutions, without judgment. He just listened. And that was enough for her to relax her shoulders for the first time in weeks. The simple act of being heard opened the door for more frequent conversations. A coffee before the meeting. A text exchange in the late afternoon. A silly comment that made her laugh. Small moments that, little by little, began to occupy a space within her. Danielle didn't seek this out. She didn't wake up one day and decide to open up emotionally to another man. It happened because, amidst the whirlwind she was facing alone, Chase offered genuine attention. And sometimes, what weighs most on the soul is precisely the absence of someone who sees us beyond the roles life imposes. With Patrick, she shared a home. With Chase, she shared what she was feeling. And that, even though it seemed small, became a dangerous bond. The looks in the hallway started to take on a different intensity. The way they greeted each other was no longer just polite. There was a mutual curiosity, almost silent, but clear. Danielle tried to push the thoughts away, tried to convince herself that this was just a temporary fantasy, a reflection of the turbulent time she was going through. But the truth was that every encounter with Chase made her feel more alive, more noticed, more understood. And over time, the line between the emotional and the physical dissolved. It was after a long day, when both stayed late finalizing a report, that everything changed. The office was already empty. The silence made it easier to have conversations that in other contexts would have been cut short by haste or the presence of others. It was a kiss. A quick, unexpected gesture, but charged with accumulated tension. And that became the trigger for something more that happened in the company's meeting room. A moment. Just that. But enough to leave Danielle shattered inside. She arrived home unable to look Patrick in the eyes. She acted as if she were exhausted, went upstairs, took a shower, and lay down in silence. She tried to convince herself that she could pretend nothing had happened. That there was still time to turn back, to erase that moment from memory and move forward. But the problem with choices is that they don't disappear. They live in the body, in the mind, in involuntary expressions. And her body was already starting to betray what she so desperately wanted to hide. Meanwhile, Patrick continued with his usual routine. He prepared dinner, made weekend plans, talked about a new project at work. Danielle listened, but every word he said pierced her like a reminder of everything she was risking. The life they had built together, the promises made, the shared glances during long nights of conversation, all now seemed tainted by a mistake she didn't know how to undo. And even without knowing what lay ahead, she already felt that this moment would change everything. Forever. Danielle spent the following days as if she were living inside a movie without sound. Everything around her seemed to move forward, but inside her, time froze in small scenes that repeated in her mind, the kiss, the touch, the guilt. She tried to act as before. Responded to messages, organized the house, kept the same pace at work. But something in her gestures was different. Her gaze lingered longer on emptiness. Her hands hesitated over simple things. Patrick, without realizing exactly what was wrong, began to slowly distance himself, as someone who feels that something has changed but doesn't have the courage to ask what it is. It was on an ordinary Sunday, during a visit from her mother, that Danielle's facade began to crumble. Sitting at the kitchen table, between one casual conversation and another, her mother commented directly, as only mothers know how, "You seem strange, distant. Is everything okay between you and Patrick?" Danielle tried to disguise it with a forced smile, but the question kept echoing. And there, in that pause when she avoided looking at her mother, she realized she could no longer hold on to the weight of what she had done alone. She spent the night thinking about how to tell him. She constructed entire sentences in her mind. Imagined the reactions. She even wrote them down on paper to try to organize her thoughts. But everything seemed too fragile. There was no way to justify it. And part of her believed that if she said it out loud, the perfect life she had built with Patrick would collapse completely. Even so, she knew hiding it was no longer an option. 2 days later, when Patrick came home early, Danielle asked him to sit down. She said she needed to talk. Her voice trembled, and he noticed. He stopped what he was doing and sat down, looking at her attentively. She hesitated. Took a deep breath. And then began to speak. She said she had been feeling confused in recent months, that the fear of becoming a mother, of losing her identity, had become a daily anguish. She talked about the emptiness, about how everything seemed suffocating. And finally, with a faltering voice and eyes full of tears, confessed that she had gotten involved with someone else. She didn't say the name. She omitted that it was Chase. She said only that it was someone from work. A moment she hadn't planned, that happened amid the internal chaos she was experiencing. She said she regretted it instantly. That since that day, she had been blaming herself. That she was willing to face the consequences. But she asked, almost in a whisper, that he listen to her until the end before making any decision. Patrick remained silent. No expression on his face. Just a fixed gaze, as if trying to make sense of it all. When Danielle finished speaking, he didn't ask anything. He stood up, grabbed the car keys, and left. She heard the sound of the door and remained motionless for a while, unable to react. Then she collapsed onto the couch, breathing unevenly, feeling the weight of having laid all her cards on the table without knowing what would come next. Patrick drove for hours, aimlessly. He thought about calling someone, but gave up. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He checked into a random motel, just to have a space where he could think. He spent the night without sleeping. He remembered all the conversations, all the good moments, the trips, the plans. And he wondered at what point all of that had started to crumble without him noticing. The betrayal hurt, but what hurt the most was the omission. The absence of a name. To him, this meant that Danielle still held something for the other man. That she was still protecting him in some way. And this cut deeper than the act of betrayal itself. When he returned home the next day, Patrick avoided any kind of conversation. He just said he needed some time. Danielle tried to start a conversation, to understand what he was thinking, but received curt responses. Patrick just left again. She insisted. Sent long messages, emails, explanations. That it didn't mean feelings, just shame. That all she wanted was to rebuild. But for Patrick, the silence about who the other person was said more than any justification. In the days that followed, he kept his distance. He slept elsewhere, claiming he needed space. Danielle, anxious, believed there was still a chance for a deeper conversation, a truce. But Patrick had already made his decision. On an ordinary afternoon, while Danielle was still at work, he discreetly returned to the house. He opened the door, walked straight to the bedroom, and began gathering his clothes, personal belongings, and important documents. He did it all silently, avoiding looking around for too long. He also separated some books, his laptop, and took an old photo of him with his parents that he always kept in the drawer. In less than an hour, everything that belonged to him was packed or folded into 2 suitcases. Before leaving, he left the key on the kitchen table, looked at the house one last time, and left without leaving notes or messages. He checked into a simple hotel, where he planned to stay for the next few days while deciding his next steps. When Danielle got home and saw the partially empty closet, his drawer open, the key on the table, her heart raced. She understood immediately, Patrick had left for good. Determined not to live with this shadow, he contacted a lawyer. He said he wanted a clean, quick process, without exhaustion. That he wanted to leave that marriage with dignity, without scandals. The lawyer understood. And so, within a few days, Danielle received the divorce papers via email. There was no note, no message, no explanation. Just the documents. When she opened them, she felt as if she was being pushed out of her own story. It was official. She was about to lose everything she had spent years trying to maintain. And this time, there was nothing more she could say. Danielle kept trying to write messages. Some she sent, others she deleted. When she saw that Patrick had read them and ignored them, a silence settled in her chest. She realized she was being treated like a stranger. Someone on the outside. A discarded presence. And as much as she knew she had been wrong, as much as she understood the magnitude of the pain she caused, she still believed she deserved, at least, one last chance to explain. But Patrick didn't want to hear any more. Not about the reason. Not about the context. For him, the decision was already made. Meanwhile, across town, Chase stared at the mirror with a discomfort he no longer knew how to hide. He remembered when Brianna, his ex-wife, had confessed a betrayal. He didn't even let her explain. He just told her to pack her things and leave. Now, after experiencing something similar with Danielle, he began to wonder how fair that past choice really was. Because, as much as he had told himself it was just a moment, he knew he had crossed a line. Danielle was married. And he knew it. He pretended it was just empathy. Pretended it was just an emotional connection. But he allowed himself to participate in something he himself had condemned before. He started remembering the conversations with Brianna, how she used to say she felt lonely, suffocated, as if she were invisible at home. He never paid real attention. He thought it was drama, exaggeration. But now, revisiting everything, he understood that emotional neglect also carries blame. And that, sometimes, those who cheat aren't just choosing someone else. They're trying to survive what had ceased to exist in the relationship. Danielle received the divorce papers and, with trembling hands, signed each page as if recognizing, line by line, the end of everything she once dreamed of. She felt as if she were burying a piece of herself. When she handed the papers to the lawyer, Patrick was present, sitting across from her, but he didn't even raise his eyes to look at her. He remained silent, distant, as if she were already just an unpleasant memory. No words, no gestures. Just the final silence of someone who had given up a long time ago. And so, without a last conversation, without a proper goodbye, the marriage came to an end. Without fights. Without scandals. Just the bitter weight of absence. A few weeks later, Danielle started feeling nauseous. Delays. Changes in her body. She bought a test and stood still for minutes staring at the result. Pregnant. Her first reaction was panic. The second was an immense void. She didn't know what to do. The fear of Patrick thinking this was an attempt at reconciliation paralyzed her. But at the same time, hiding it would mean repeating a mistake that had cost her dearly. So she took a deep breath and decided to reach out to him. When she told him, Patrick looked at her with a mix of surprise and suspicion. He didn't react with anger, but made it clear he needed certainty. He requested a DNA test even during the pregnancy. Danielle, hurt by the mistrust, understood the reason and agreed. They went to a specialized clinic, where a non-invasive prenatal test was performed, collecting a blood sample from her and comparing it with Patrick's genetic material. The test analyzed fragments of the fetus's DNA circulating in her bloodstream. Without needing needles in the uterus, the result came quickly. When they opened the envelope, it was there, written, what she already knew and he needed confirmed: the baby was his. Even so, Patrick didn't celebrate, nor did he change his tone. He simply said that he understood his responsibility as a father. That he would support the child. And that he would follow the pregnancy. But regarding her, the relationship was over. Danielle swallowed her pride and accepted. She wasn't asking for anything anymore. She just wanted her child to be loved. During the following months, Patrick began attending some of her appointments. They didn't talk much, but they shared silences. He offered to drive her, pick her up, help with whatever he could. And even though the gesture was still distant, there was care there. The birth of Eden changed something inside him. For the first time in a long while, Patrick cried. Holding his daughter in his arms connected him with a feeling he couldn't describe. And from that moment on, everything began to revolve around her. Danielle, observing this man who was once her husband and now was only the father of her child, felt a mixture of gratitude and pain. He was present, careful, learning to change diapers, give baths, put her to sleep. But with her, he maintained an invisible barrier. They only talked about the girl. No openings for reconciliation. No gesture indicating anything beyond co-parenting. And she understood that she couldn't force what was broken. That there were mistakes that, even if forgiven, still changed everything forever. Time passed, and Patrick visited Eden regularly. He brought toys, books, built blocks on the rug, told stories. He started discovering a new version of himself. One that laughed easily and marveled at each discovery of his daughter. And the more the bond between father and daughter grew, the more Patrick solidified the idea that true love can arise even after everything falls apart. His relationship with Danielle remained practical, straightforward. But with Eden, he allowed himself to be whole. Without fear. Without reservations. Motherhood also transformed Danielle. The anxiety, the fear of losing her identity, all of that gave way to an intense connection with her daughter. She began to understand that being a mother didn't make her less of a woman, less free, or less capable. It simply awakened sides of herself she didn't know existed. And it was in this new cycle that she began to rebuild herself. Silently, without rush, and with a clarity that hadn't existed before. Both went down different paths, but tied by a bond that could never be broken. Eden became the point of balance. The link that kept them connected, even through different routes. And life, in an almost ironic way, offered them what they had always avoided, a fresh start. Only in formats they never imagined. As time went on, Patrick found a new routine. His constant presence in Eden's life brought out a version of himself he didn't know existed. He learned to bathe her, change diapers, calm cries without reason, and caught himself smiling even through exhaustion. The bond with his daughter grew every day, and he made sure to be present for her first steps, her first words, visits to the pediatrician. It was as if all the love he had held back for months was now channeled into that tiny life. Taking care of Eden gave him purpose, balance. And, somehow, it closed a wound that once seemed impossible to heal. One day at a cafe near work, Patrick met Haley. He was having lunch alone, reviewing emails on his phone, when she sat at the next table and asked for help connecting to the Wi-Fi. The conversation started with a quick exchange of words and evolved into small casual meetings during breaks over the next few days. Haley was a physiotherapist, working at a clinic 2 blocks away. She had a direct, no-nonsense way about her, but at the same time, she was gentle. Patrick wasn't looking for anything, but he enjoyed talking to her. It was different. There were no expectations, just companionship that made the days lighter. Gradually, he started looking forward to those moments, until they exchanged contacts and began chatting outside the cafe setting. When he felt it was fair, Patrick opened up. He said he was a father, that he had gone through a difficult divorce, and that he was still trying to sort things out internally. Haley listened attentively, without interrupting. Then, she responded naturally, "Everyone carries a story. What's important is being honest about it." This struck a chord with Patrick. For the first time in a long while, he felt he was in front of someone who saw him fully, without judgment. It wasn't immediate, but he allowed her to get closer. And when he decided to introduce her to Eden, he realized he had made the right choice. Meanwhile, Danielle watched everything from a distance. She focused on Eden, did what she needed to do as a mother, but every new update about Patrick's life hit her like a constant reminder of everything she had lost. She still felt responsible, still mentally replayed what she could have done differently. She tried to move on, but no new relationships clicked. She couldn't trust, couldn't let go. And, in silence, she began accepting the idea that, at least for now, her mission was different. She devoted herself entirely to her daughter, dove into studies, sought to understand motherhood more deeply. She found meaning in small moments with Eden. It was in her daughter's hugs, in the "Mommy, I love you," before bedtime, that she found the strength to keep going. Danielle also noticed the affection between Eden and Haley. At first, she felt a pang of jealousy. It was strange to see another woman becoming part of her daughter's routine. But over time, this turned into relief. Haley never tried to take anyone's place. She respected, helped, added. And Danielle understood that what mattered most was Eden's well-being. This taught her that love doesn't need to be exclusive to be true. Time passed. Patrick and Haley formalized their relationship. They did it quietly, without big parties. They simply decided to walk together. They lived in the same house, had their routines with Eden, their quiet Sundays, and trips to simple places. What they built was based on truth, on complicity. Patrick no longer talked about the past. Not out of resentment, but because he had turned the page. Eden was the living link between everything that had passed and what was yet to come. And he cherished that link as if it were the center of his world. Danielle, for her part, moved forward in her own way. She didn't rebuild a new relationship, but she rebuilt herself. She had good days, tough days, but she no longer carried guilt. Just memories. She learned to live with the choices she made and the consequences that followed. And even though she didn't recover what she lost, she knew her daughter was growing surrounded by love. Sometimes, that was enough. The story that seemed like a painful ending ultimately transformed into a cycle of growth for everyone involved. None of them returned to who they were before. Everyone changed. Everyone learned. And, above all, everyone understood that starting over is possible, as long as one is willing to do things differently. There was no perfect ending, but there was rebuilding. And, in the end, that's what matters. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.